Hi, today we're going to take a deep dive into Eric Whitacre's modern classic, Sleep. Now, you don't need me to tell you the history of this piece because it's all written there in the front of every copy. But it's still interesting. Setting aside the mildly embarrassing, tear-jerking platitude about something as simple and delicate as the choral art, I just find it an intriguing idea that we've got here a piece of music where the music was written very specifically for one set of words. Then those words were taken away, leaving just the notes, and then a whole new set of words was written to fit those notes. Now, this isn't the only time it's ever happened. It's a reasonably common phenomenon in the worlds of folk music, some hymn writing, some popular stuff. But it's unusual in art music, especially for songs where the original words and the notes are so closely linked. And I like it. It reminds me a bit of the game of consequences. And I kind of want to know what happens now if you repeat the process a few more times. What if you take away Whitaker's music and then give the new poem to a different composer to set? And so on and so on. Who knows? Maybe if you repeat the loop enough times, you might eventually get back to stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Anyway, the takeaway for the musician here is that this is one of those songs where the connection between the music and the text is extremely close, perhaps even more so than normal because of the weird way it came about. And we know from what Whitaker writes in his introduction, and indeed from the music itself, that the synergy between words and music is not just a broad thing, but it's actually done at a very fine-grained level of detail. The poet has worked really hard to fit the words to the music literally on a word-by-word basis. And communicating this is going to be a vital job for the choir. Also, make a note in your calendar for 2038, when the original Frost poem finally drops back out of copyright, and I bet we see a glut of smart-ass choir conductors pasting the original words back in for their winter concerts. Something to look forward to. So I would approach teaching this piece in one of two ways, depending on the kind of choir I was working with. With a choir that's okay at sight reading, or where a number of singers might know the piece already, or where the genre is familiar, I'd start at the beginning. Since the piece is kind of episodic anyway, that's a perfectly good place to start. They can discover it as they go along, and you can support them as they need support. On the other hand, with a choir that's less good at sight reading, which maybe needs to run through some or most of the lines by ear, well, firstly, prepare yourself for a fairly long learning period. Singers who sing by musical intuition and memory will find this piece less accessible to start with because it's not really structured in a predictable way. With that kind of group, I would consider starting not at the beginning, but actually at the very end, with the last phrase, that long fade to back. This passage is enchanting and memorable, and it contains very few notes, so they can immediately feel like they've achieved something when they make that diminuendo really work. Then you can work backwards from there, phrase by phrase. This method of teaching a piece backwards, as it were, is actually one of my favourite techniques with choirs that need a lot of hand-holding up front. When you work from the back to the front, it means that each time the choir learns a new phrase, they always get led back to familiar territory afterwards. And I find this can build confidence more firmly than starting at the beginning when you're always running on into new unfamiliar stuff. Also, on a practical note, it means that you have the option to end the rehearsal in a satisfying way anytime you need to. Even if you're only halfway through learning the piece, you can simply say, okay, we'll just finish working on this phrase and then we'll sing through to the end. That's an option you don't have if you're working from the beginning and you get bogged down in the middle. Whichever way you do it, it might also be a good idea if you have the option to play the singers a recording before their first sing. Ask them to sit and listen and follow the score but not to hum their own parts. The idea is to familiarize themselves with the overall feeling of the piece, and in particular the kinds of harmonic effects that Whitaker uses. Now, to be honest, I rarely use recordings in rehearsal, but for this kind of music where the chords are colourful and the chord sequences are not immediately intuitive, it can help to hear the idiom before you try to sing it. And listening to a reasonably good recording is miles better than hearing the piano plonk its way through those homophonic passages. Unless you have very good sight singers, there are lots of phrases you'll need to approach quite carefully in this piece. Whittaker's harmonic language is actually fairly steady for the most part, but he likes to keep rearranging chords between voices, so no part gets away with an easy sing. It stops it from getting boring, I guess. I won't list every phrase in the piece, but let's take one phrase with some interesting notes as an example. So bars 21 to 26, I cannot sleep, my mind's aflight. There are two ways for less confident singers to learn the notes here. One, I guess the more conventional approach, is horizontally. Each part learns to sing their passage securely from left to right, and then you build up the layers to put it together. This tackles the challenge by training singers to sing their intervals accurately, which is important, of course. The other approach is vertical. The whole choir goes slowly from chord to chord, learning to tune not by their own internal intervals, but rather by fitting into the harmonies around them. If your singers normally learn by ear, then I guess you have no choice. You have to start horizontal because they can't just pluck their notes out of nowhere. But if they're moderately confident sight singing from the page, then I think this is a piece where it's actually a good idea to try the vertical approach instead. Because what will really make passages like this sound secure, and there are a lot of passages like this, is not just for singers to know their own intervals, but for them to know how to place their notes inside the chords. Once they're familiar with their part's contribution to the overall crunchy harmonies, they will need to worry a bit less about the intervals, and their tuning will be much better too. This is especially true when the individual intervals get fiddly, like the E natural, E flat switches that crop up a few times. Pitching these might be okay, but tuning them horizontally is hard. How do you know exactly how wide or narrow to make each gap when there's no surrounding context? But tuning them vertically is much easier, when you can hear how your E flat or E natural sounds in the overall chord. Accurate intonation comes almost for free, as it were. Moving on. In this piece, tenors and basses have to be able to switch registers smoothly all the time without drawing attention to themselves. The phrase, upon my pillow safe in bed, is one smooth phrase, but it has that gear change for the men. It needs to be a smooth switch. Here's how it sounds. The same with the phrase, fill my head, and the repetitions of dark, as in dark and deep. Although the darks are a bit easier because the vowel is so rich, the dynamic is so permissive, that singers might not even need to switch registers. They can just sing it all in a lovely full voice. This, by the way, is choral writing by someone who really knows how to write for voices. Full credit to Whittaker. The whole loud passage is not only electrifying to listen to, but an absolute joy to sing. The perfect vowel, the perfect place in the register for each part. And it's so easy to make the fortissimo broad and expansive rather than punchy. If there is a danger, it's running out of breath support towards the end of the elongated last phrase. It's a classic tuning trap. You're running out of breath, the volume is dropping, the notes are coming down, and there's a dissonance at the end too. With the best will in the world, going flat is a real risk here. Assuming you have a large enough group, the easiest solution to this issue, apart from taking big breaths earlier on, is to allow singers to cheat by staggering their breathing. It's vital that nobody feels they have to strain at the end of the phrase. And you might also need to pay some attention to the vowel in the very last word, sleep. When the notes get low, the mouth shape shouldn't be a very smiley E, because that leads to a thin sound, and higher up it even sounds shrill for sopranos. Work on more of an ooh shape with the lips to keep it rich and warm, so the result is more like sleep. Listen to the vowel on this recording, you'll see what I mean. And right there, at the end of bar 62, before we get to the coda, as it were, let singers cool off and take a great big breath. They mustn't enter bar 63 still with all the tension in their voices from the preceding bars. Thankfully, Whittaker has your back here with this tiny but really important breath mark. There's a nice moment too a bit earlier where Whittaker drops a sudden heavy bare fifth into the middle of all those rich chords. And of course, the word here is lead. Ha ha. So make a lot of the L and make the vowel dark so the audience doesn't miss the joke. Well, it's not really a joke, I guess. Also, notice the different lengths of the notes. It's not as fiddly as it looks, it's just to give everyone time to breathe before the next phrase. And of course, you're going to have to rehearse the ending. But that's okay, people will like rehearsing this. Now, fades to black are frequently written in modern music, but I always find they're easier to write than they are to actually pull off. Composers sometimes don't seem to realize that there's quite a big gap between the quietest possible good quality note you can sing and silence. Practice it with your choir. See how far you can stretch out that diminuendo before it either peters out or becomes too wobbly, and then that's where your fade to black has to end. Whittaker, by the way, uses the word whisper here, but I think he means that to describe the dynamic, something like PPPP, and not the tone. For me, getting all breathy and whispery sounds a bit lame at this point, but that's a personal preference. I've heard it done that way too. By the way, speaking of very quiet passages, I think this style of music often benefits from asking just a little bit more from the basses than from the other parts. The thicker and more complex the chords, the more you want the basses to give a solid foundation, and the nicer that foundation sounds. A nice rich bass line, especially divided basses, will really enhance the sections marked piano or pianissimo. At this particular moment, on What Dreams May Come, Whittaker even emphasizes this with a crescendo for the basses, which nobody else gets. This is unusual since the basses don't even have the words here, but just listen to the effect. It's word painting again. Everyone is singing dark and deep, but the bass is particularly so. Now, we already know what we want the audience to experience with this piece. It's all about the marriage between the music and the words. Every single musical phrase is calibrated to support the meaning of the words, or rather, every single word is calibrated to fit with the music, but whatever. And Whittaker's writing is clever enough that most of the work is done for you. You don't have to work extra hard to communicate flying wings and soaring leap, because the music just does it. And when you look closely, you see the same attention to detail everywhere. We talked a moment ago about how carefully the notes reflect the words on dark and deep. Think also about the clouded clusters of notes on clouds of dream. Or the wonderfully eerie word painting on If There Are Noises in the Night, with the thread of that middle C running through the entire passage and beyond. As I said, this stuff is everywhere, and the music does all of it for you. But While in some styles of singing your job is to get out of the way of that, here it's the opposite. Your job is to draw the audience's attention to it. That means singers have to be consciously aware of what the composer is doing all the way through and why, and then really lean into it. There's no room for deliberate reticence or restraint here. This is not Bird or Tallis. This wears its heart on its sleeve, probably embroidered with gold trim and dripping with gore. It's not quite melodrama, but it's certainly drama. If, like me, you're from the other side of the pond and you're not quite familiar with how this kind of modern American music is received by singers and audiences, have a quick search on YouTube for any high school choir performance of this piece, or really of any piece by Whittaker. And then have a quick scroll through the comments under those videos. You'll get the idea pretty quickly. Or you could read a Politico article about Whittaker, which I'll link in the description for this video. Apparently his hair is a thing with its own Facebook page. Now conducting. Your conducting gestures will be similarly versatile and expressive. Big expansive moments call for big expansive conducting. Quiet, intimate moments call for restraint. In other words, this is fun to conduct. Also, support the singer's diction. It goes without saying that it's vital to put the words across clearly so the audience get what's going on. Even when it's PP, especially when it's PP, singers have to work really hard to enunciate. That's about the voice to some extent, but it's also just as much about posture and facial expression and eye contact. And these are things that you, as a conductor, can model and lead as they perform. Look at how an actor does a stage whisper. They don't just enunciate, they also lean forward, widen their eyes, overdo their facial movements. And that's what the choir needs from you so they can convey it to the audience. Well, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into sleep, so to speak. My name is Toby Wardman, and this is not my only rodeo. There are deep dives into a growing number of other pieces to be found in the same place that you found this, whether that is YouTube, where you can offer your own experiences via the comments, or on your favorite podcast player, where you can't interact at all, but you can be baffled by all the casual references to things you can't see. So, see you next time. Bye.